9 experienced hikers cut open their own tent from the inside and ran barefoot into a freezing blizzard. The temperature outside was 30 below zero. They never came back, and what investigators found on their bodies defied every logical explanation. In February of 1959, a group of 10 young adventurers set out on a skiing expedition through the northern Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union. They were not amateurs. These were experienced mountaineers, many of them university students and graduates, led by a 23-year-old engineer named Igor Dyatlov. They were attempting to earn the highest hiking certification in the Soviet Union, a feat that required surviving in harsh winter conditions for weeks. One member turned back early due to illness. The remaining 9 pushed forward into the snow-covered wilderness. They were never seen alive again. When the group failed to send a telegram confirming their return, worried relatives pushed for a search. Rescue teams reached the mountain weeks later, and what they discovered on a remote slope now known as Dyatlov Pass would become one of the most disturbing mysteries of the 20th century. The first thing searchers found was the tent. It was still standing on the mountainside, but it had been slashed open, not from the outside, from the inside. Knives had cut through the canvas as though the hikers were desperate to escape something terrifying and could not wait for the zipper. Shoes, coats, and warm supplies were still neatly arranged inside the tent. Whatever made them flee, it happened suddenly, and it happened at night. But why would 9 experienced winter hikers abandon their only shelter, half-dressed in a deadly blizzard? The obvious answer, the one Soviet investigators leaned toward initially, was simple. A severe avalanche had struck in the darkness, forcing the group to cut their way out and flee in panic. It is a clean explanation. It makes sense on paper. An avalanche hits, people panic, they run, some freeze, some fall. Case closed, except the case was not closed. It was barely beginning. The bodies told a different story entirely. The first 2 hikers were found near a cedar tree about a mile from the tent. They were barefoot and dressed only in their underwear. The tree above them had broken branches up to 15 feet high, suggesting one of them had climbed it in a desperate attempt to look back toward the camp. Their hands were burned, as if they had tried to warm themselves over a fire they never managed to keep going. They died of hypothermia. 3 more bodies were found between the tree and the tent, scattered across the snow. They were also partially clothed and also died of exposure. But here is where the story stops making sense. The remaining 4 hikers were not found for another 2 months. They were buried under 4 meters of snow in a ravine, and their injuries were unlike anything investigators had seen. These were not frozen bodies. These were crushed bodies. One hiker had major skull damage. 2 others had catastrophic chest fractures so severe that a Soviet doctor later compared the force required to that of a car crash. And yet there were no external wounds on any of them. No cuts, no bruises, no signs of violence on the surface of their skin. Their bones were shattered from the inside as if crushed by an impossible pressure that left no mark. And then there was the woman, Lyudmila Dubinina. She was found missing her tongue, her eyes, and part of her skull. The tissue was gone completely. Some of the other hikers showed similar, though less extensive, soft tissue damage. The official reports offered no satisfying explanation. If this were an avalanche, where was the physical evidence of one? Investigators examined the terrain around the tent and found no indication that snow had swept over the camp. The snow above and below the tent was undisturbed. The tent itself was still standing, still partially buried, but not crushed by a wall of moving snow. Skis and equipment were still propped upright nearby. An avalanche that powerful enough to shatter ribs and crush skulls would have destroyed the tent and scattered it across the slope. But the tent was intact, just cut open, sitting exactly where the hikers had pitched it. So if it was not an avalanche, what could shatter human bones without breaking the skin? What could make 9 seasoned mountaineers flee into certain death in their underwear? Here is where the story takes a darker turn. When the clothing and bodies were finally examined in a laboratory, something unexpected appeared. Several pieces of clothing worn by the hikers were found to be radioactive, not slightly above background level, significantly contaminated, the type of readings you might associate with proximity to nuclear material or testing sites. Soviet investigators could not explain it. The hikers had not worked with radioactive materials. Their route did not pass near any known facility, and the mystery does not stop there. Investigators who examined the scene noted that the skin of several hikers had a strange orange or grey tint. Reports mentioned that the victims looked artificially aged, as if something had exposed them to a force that altered their skin at a deep level. Some searchers and locals in the region reported seeing strange glowing orange spheres in the night sky over the mountain range around the time the hikers died. Similar sightings were reported by other independent witnesses across the northern Urals that February. The Soviet military even launched an investigation into the aerial phenomena. None of this made it into the original public report. The case was classified. The files were sealed in a secret archive and remained hidden from the public for over 30 years. When the Soviet government finally released the documents in the 1990s, it emerged that the lead investigator, a man named Lev Ivanov, had been pressured by high-ranking officials to close the case quickly and quietly. In his private notes, written years later, Ivanov admitted that he believed the hikers had encountered something beyond ordinary explanation. He could not prove what, but he was never allowed to try. So what actually happened on that mountain? Over the decades, dozens of theories have emerged. Some researchers argue that a rare phenomenon, called a slab avalanche, triggered when a layer of hardened snow above the tent fractured, could explain the rush to flee and even some of the crushing injuries. Modern simulations have shown that under the right conditions, a small slab of snow could slide over the tent with enough mass to cause blunt force trauma. The missing tongues and eyes, skeptics argue, could be the result of natural decomposition and scavenging animals in the months before the bodies were found. But even the strongest scientific theories leave gaps. The radioactive contamination has never been fully explained. The radiation levels were high enough that they appear in the official forensic records, yet no source was ever identified. The orange skin tone remains unaccounted for under the avalanche theory. The glowing spheres, dismissed by some as weather balloons or military tests, were reported independently by credible witnesses, including meteorologists and military personnel. And the precise, devastating internal injuries, broken ribs and skulls, without a single external wound, remain difficult to reproduce through snow alone. Some believe the hikers stumbled into the path of a secret Soviet weapons test, perhaps a parachute-delivered explosive or a thermobaric device that generated a blast wave capable of shattering bones internally while leaving skin intact. The radiation under this theory would have come from the weapon itself. The government cover-up would explain the classified files and the pressure on the investigator. Others point to infrasound, a low-frequency sound wave generated by wind passing over the mountain that could have induced pure terror and irrational behavior, causing the hikers to flee in panic without dressing. And still others insist the answer is something we have not yet learned to understand. In 2019, the Russian government officially reopened the case and concluded once again that an avalanche was the most probable cause. But they also acknowledged that the investigation could not rule out other factors, and they closed the files without addressing the radiation, the tissue damage, or the aerial sightings. The mountain itself was renamed. It is no longer just Nameless Peak 1079. It is now officially called Dyatlov Pass, named after the young leader who never came home. 9 people walked into the frozen dark of the Urals and never returned. They left behind a slashed tent, shattered bodies, contaminated clothing, and a silence that has lasted more than 60 years. We may never know what they saw that night, but the fact that we are still asking, still searching, still unable to close this case tells you something. Some mysteries do not want to be solved, they want to be remembered. If you want more stories like this one, the ones that refuse to stay buried, subscribe to Night